Land and water are the main resources on which human beings have built their civilizations. Right from ancient times to modern times, these continue to be the most important resources for human survival as well as for the building of human cultures and whatever are the products of the human technology. And because these are the most important resources, we find that from times immemorial, these are the two basic resources over which conflicts have taken place from ancient to the pre-industrial era. Even maybe not the foraging societies, which had very small populations distributed over very large areas, and they had little reason to come in conflict with each other because they were not controlling any resources. All the resources in their environment was free goods. The forest was a free good, the rivers and streams were free goods, so were the animals that roamed in them. But from the time of pastoral nomadic communities and the shifting cultivators, we find that some kind of ownership of resources is becoming necessary. Because pastoral people have large herds of animals which are individually owned, and these animals need grazing land which can be very extensive, and also water which they need in very large quantities. So large quantities of water, that is entire streams or parts of river and large pastures, need to be controlled by the group. And this kind of ownership is always community ownership. That is, it is also associated with what we call as rights of user, but not right of possession. But animals being a mobile resource, they can stray into each other's areas, and also there is always a tendency to capture them and also to intrude into the pastoral lands because these are valuable resources. So history tells us that from pastoral communities we have the development of what we call as conflicting neighbors. So neighboring pastoral communities, whether they were in the East African cattle belt, Middle East, or even the warring or the military technology that was developed by the Mongols and the Huns, very large pastoral, in fact, entire pastoral civilizations are known in history. And also the pastoralists had the advantage of having, they could mount, like they had horses and camels which they could mount, and they were mobile. So we see the predatory nature of the nomads, which are documented in various parts of medieval and ancient times. So that is the time from where conflicts over resources really began. And the same for horticultural societies also, which have large tracts of land lying fallow, there are possibilities of conflict because this fallow land can be captured, and neighboring tribes who have fallow lands lying next to each other have a tendency to creep and try to raid for these lands. For example, Nagaland, the Naga tribes, they were in constant conflict over pasture lands, and also and while they are capturing animals, capturing land, these communities also had tendency to capture human beings for slaves, women for marriage, and so on and so forth. So there was this conflicting kind of a culture that triggered certain lines of social evolution. But these were only for the basic resources of land and water. But another kind of conflict for resources begins with industrial capitalism, which began in Europe from the 15th century onward, though it really became crystallized or really developed and also became very predatory during the 16th and 17th century, because as the industrial technologies were growing in Europe, there was a desperation to look for resources to feed those industries. You could not have these industries unless you had the raw materials. You could not develop your economy unless you had more land and more labor resources. And to look for them, the Europeans went all across the globe, and they had developed, because of their development of science, they had developed the navigation skills, built ships that could sail from one end of the earth to the other, and they went looking for many kinds of resources. There was a hunger for land, because Europe is they were very small countries, they hardly had any land. So they needed more land to expand as the populations were expanding because of technological advancement. Those who were still there in Europe, they needed more material resources, raw materials for their industries. They needed labor. And sometimes, and this is how colonization began. As we know, there were many countries that were completely taken over by the Europeans, and there were many countries which they occupied, like India, only to exploit the labor and the material resources like forests, minerals. And there were specific resources over which, like for example, there are the famous Pashmina wars, which took place between the British, the Russians, and also at that time the independent country of Punjab that was controlled by Maharaja Ranjit Singh. There were numerous, not numerous, but there were several battles that took place, and one of the prime coveted resources was Pashmina wool. And then during the period of colonization, the locals, the natives, that is the colonies that were colonized, they did not give up. Like when we talk of conflict, it is not a one-way thing that they couldn't go and just colonize people. They just couldn't go and just live there and take away their resources. And there was some fundamental basic principles on which the conflicts took place. In Bengal, we know that there was this very famous rebellion, a peasant rebellion, which is known as the Indigo Rebellion, the Indigo Revolt, which took place around 1956 to 1960, because in 1960 a commission was formed and which ultimately tried to resolve this revolt. But initially, when the British colonizers came in, they were just trying to take away what was for the peasants the land on which they cultivated their food crops. Rice cultivation was taking place on the land, and some fallow land was also taken for them for indigo cultivation, and indigo was mainly a cash crop. Indigo was a crop that the British required as a dye for their cloth industry back in their own country. It had no use, the local people had no use for it, they never used it. And with indigo cultivation, the fertility of the land used to go down so much that once a land was cultivated for indigo, it became completely useless for food crop cultivation. And this gave rise to a lot of resentment on part of the peasants, because all this was being forced on them. They didn't want it. They didn't want to cultivate indigo, and the British administrators, the people who came in, just the Britishers, who thought that they had all rights over these lands because they had conquered them, they put a lot of force, a lot of oppression, and there is this very famous Bengali novel that was written, which is considered as a classic, called Neel Darpan, which has described all the kind of hardships that the peasants undergo, and also their struggle, how they struggled, how they fought the British. Although they didn't have the guns, they didn't have the power, but they still fought them, and the conflict came to such a pass that in 1960 the British were forced to form a commission, the Grant Commission, which had to look into these matters, and many of the problems were solved. And one of the main one was that nobody could be forced to cultivate indigo, and if the peasant did not want to give their land, they could not, they were not, they could not take away the land from them. And this was not a single incident. Entire globe we see that during the period of colonization, there was forced extraction, and there was a forced usurpation of the lands and resources of the original owners. And from this word original owners has come the term indigenous that we use today. The indigenous basically refers to all those people who lived in those countries and who owned the land and resources of the countries that were later taken away by the colonizers. We know that from the 16th century onward, the entire color of the world changed. There were these countries like New Zealand, Australia and America, which today we know as white countries, occupied by white people. But they were not so before colonization. They were the countries of the brown people, the black people who lived there. And they were completely exterminated. They were exterminated with so much force that entire tribes died out. Nobody, not even a last person was left. But again, at every point of time there was conflict. The locals fought with their bows and arrows, with whatever little technology they had of fighting, and the British of course had the advantage of, it was not always British, it was other European communities that had the advantage of their gunpowder technology. Even in the post-colonial era, what we call as the modern era, this conflict for resources has not died out. It still continues in the form of neo-colonization, in the form of neoliberal economy, and examples of this are in very modern times also. For example, there is this very famous and ongoing conflict of the Deni First Nation. Now again in Canada, what we call as Adivasis in India, that is the indigenous population who are called indigenous in many parts of the world like Malaysia and Indonesia and New Zealand, are called as First Nation in Canada. The First Nation are the people who lived there, who were the first owners of this nation. Now these Deni are a First Nation people who went against the Canadian government after they wanted to lay the Mackenzie Valley pipeline, which is a very famous example, and that this was going to be laid through the entire tribal owned, the First Nation owned territory for supplying petroleum gas from the Arctic to North America and Canada, urban areas of Canada. And then again, since there was so much protest by environmentalists, there was so much conflict that accompanied the proposal of this pipeline, Mackenzie Valley pipeline, that and the argument of the First Nation people was, and this is the very important argument that has been upheld in current times when conflict over resources have taken place, that is the argument of livelihood. Now, the eco-philosophical arguments that nature is sacred, all this has not been accepted in the legal courts. But what has accepted in the legal courts is the argument for livelihood and way of life. The right to livelihood, the right to a particular culture, that is the argument that has held. So the Denny said that we have a bush-based economy, and this bush-based economy, which actually if you read the Berger Commission report, it translates actually into billions of dollars. Once they tried to put a market value on all that the Denny were collecting from the forest and the market value of their furs and their products and their animals, it came to billions of dollars. So that particular, in fact within the capitalist framework, this argument was made, and it simply was done because they have a non-monetary economy. They do not have any monetary compensation for what they earn and what they consume. But once a monetary value was put on these things, the figures came out to be staggering, and that clinched the argument. So in 2017 it was, in 2004 it was stalled. It was stalled, and then it was revived again in 2004. But then again the same kind of protests began, because even in 2004, as late as 2004, in the 21st century, the Denny were not prepared to give up their traditional mode. In fact, they were using different technology to sustain the same bush-based economy. Now they were using helicopters, now they were using guns, but still they wanted to continue with their hunting and food gathering way of life. And finally in 2017, and also with the support of Barack Obama, who also wanted this to be abandoned, finally the pipeline has been abandoned. And this is one of the major successes of the indigenous people against the capitalist economy. So the reasons for conflict, as we see, are not a direct conflict which is just about the resources. The reason for conflict lie much deeper. They lie amongst the philosophies, the norms, the values that are held by different communities with respect to nature and its resources. We also have, when I am giving the example of the Mackenzie River pipeline, very recently in India we also had the Vedanta project being shelved because of the protest by the Lanchia Saura tribes who occupy the Niamgiri forest, the Niamgiri area, and for them, for these tribals, Niamgiri is a sacred, it's a god, and they did not want mining in Niamgiri. But again, the argument did not hold on the basis of sacredness, but the argument held when it was pleaded that the mining would completely destroy the economy, the local economy and the mode of livelihood of so many people who are dependent on the forest and this mountain. But from an ecological point of view, the Niamgiri forest is not just something that provides livelihood to these tribals, but it is a kind of aqua duct. It has numerous aqueducts that provide underground water to the agriculturalist economies who are lying all around it for miles, for many, many miles, for all around the environment. So it would have actually destroyed not only of the Sauras, but the entire agricultural economy of that area, causing acute famine and food shortage. Then again we have this concept of property or the concept of resource. Most of the indigenous people and the non-capitalist people look at the environment as food producers, as food givers, as subsistence, as providing them with water, with something to eat, and also of course something to live by. But from the capitalist point of view, this mountains, rivers, forest, everything translates into cashable items like, as in the case of Niamgiri, it is the aluminium. It is a bauxite reserve. It is actually an entire mountain of bauxite, and they wanted to extract the aluminium. The same thing happens for the coal. Now the coal mining, the way it is done, especially in the USA, what they call as mountain top, they completely remove the mountain top while mining. So that has a completely destructive effect on the environment and causes loss of food subsistence. So whether we are looking at the environment as something of use value, something which we can consume, or it is to be translated only into money value, that is into exchange value, and only evaluated in terms of a marketable commodity, that is a very different, a very opposed kind of philosophy. Similarly, we have the famous case in the case study in India, and which has been recorded very nicely by Ramachandra Guha, but by other scholars also, about the Chipko movement. But as Guha has historically traced the background to the Chipko movement, which actually took place in the 70s, but the background to the Chipko movement goes back to the early decades of the 20th century, when a British occupancy first started in the Kumaon region. And there again the clash was between looking at the forest as common property for usage by the villagers, or was it an individually owned property that could be disposed of. So you have two kinds of property rights, of use value and of possession. Possession also carries with it the right of disposition, that is, if I own the forest, I can also sell it away. But when it is a community property, when it is only for user right, you can only use the products of the forest, you cannot sell it, you cannot cut the trees, you can usually use their products. Now this two value systems clashed, and they had started clashing right from the early decades of the 20th century, where, as Guha has recorded, various time periods almost on a regular basis, conflicts had begun between the peasants and their rulers. Now the Kumaon, as we know, unlike Garhwal, which was left to the, during the British period, Uttarakhand, what we understand as Uttarakhand today, was divided into two parts, Kumaon and Garhwal. Garhwal was left with the original owner, the Raja of Garhwal, but Kumaon became a British territory. So we find that there were more conflicts in Kumaon than there were in Garhwal. And all this Chipko movement, it started in, it accumulated, it was a cumulative effect of these repeated and recurrent peasant movements and clash over forest resources that were taking place in Kumaon right from the early 20th century. I mean, the kind of protests that the peasants were engaging in were even to set fire to the forest. There were repeated fires in the state-owned parts of the forest by the peasants who wanted to burn the forest to. It was a mode of, they could not fight with their guns, but they could fight in their own ways. So, and they also, and another way was to refuse to work. Because obviously, even if you wanted to cut the forest or you wanted to set up industry, you needed labor. Now, if the local labor absolutely refused to work, then it was impossible for them to carry out these actions. So, these are some of the ways when we talk of resource conflicts. There are many ways in which the local people have engaged in these conflicts. And in the modern day also, this state versus local conflicts is often given the shape of national interests. The state, for example, evokes the concept of an eminent domain when it wants to take away forest tracts or forest lands. And the main problem has been for these indigenous people, the forest dwelling people, that they have been living in these areas for millions of years. We don't even know from when they have been living. But in those days, from the time when they began to live, there were nothing like property rights, there were no paperwork. So they don't have any formal, and this is one of the ways in which a large numbers of forest dwellers have been evicted in the modern times from the forest. So once traditional modes of ownership are opposed to the formal, legal, modern ways of ownership, there is a great disadvantage for people who were the traditional owners. Because once they are trying, for example, now, if somebody goes into a forest and asks them for pattas, they don't have them, but they don't even know what it means. So it gives a huge, you can say, a gateway for those in power to take away these resources from their original owners. And this has been used time and again right from the pre-colonial times, not so much during the feudal era, but definitely from the colonial times, to take away or divest resources from their original owner, whether they were landowners or they were forest dwellers or they had rights over forest, land and water. These traditional rights, which were only rights of user carried on over generations and generations of use, were not codified. Today's laws are codified. You need certain material evidence to show that I have rights, which did not exist before. And this has been one mode of devastation, and another has been this rhetoric of national interest, where even for the use of, for example, you take forest dwellers away from forest in the name of conservation, and then tourist hotels are built inside it. So that is serving the interests of the capitalist economy, and that is a continued source of conflict, and which continues as of today. And it is a very modern, a very contemporary, and in this moment mode of conflict resource. And there I think one has to think in terms of, again, a long-term implications. What are the long-term implications of these kind of resource conflicts? Where is it going to lead us? Are we going towards inevitable environmental destruction, or will we be able to find a modified way in which what we call as national interest and environmental interest can be balanced? But before we talk about the movements, let us be more clear about who are these tribes. In the global context, the term tribe is hardly used. The term used is indigenous communities, and they refer to those communities that were occupying a particular geographical area or country which was later colonized by the Europeans, which includes New Zealand, Australia, Canada, America. And in these countries, the original occupants were almost completely removed or very severely marginalized into what are known as reservations, that today they do not form part of the mainstream life in any of these countries. Now, in that context, Indian government has also pleaded that we cannot use the term indigenous because everybody in India is indigenous, because we don't have that kind of colonization situation. But in India, the term tribe has been used for those communities that are not part of what we call as the mainstream India. That is, they do not belong to any one of the major religions of India, though at present a very large number of them, a substantial number of them, have been converted to Christianity by the Christian missionaries during the colonial period, because many of them were so far away from the mainstream of India that they had no idea of belonging to India. So entire Northeast India, for example, the 8 states of Northeast India were not part of the Indian mainland, either culturally or by trade or by any kind of social or political or economic relationship. So taking advantage of the relative isolation from the mainland, the Christian missionaries had converted them almost totally to Christianity. That is also one way in which they have remained separated from mainland India and are regarded as tribal communities. A second dimension of tribal communities has been that most of them have not been part of the mainstream economic relationships, but that is also not very true, because that is also one way in which they have remained separated from mainland India and are regarded as tribal communities. Thank you.